Welcome, everybody, on behalf of the Hudson River Museum to our program for today. I see that I don't see anybody in the waiting room at the moment, Olivia, so
No, I think right now we're good. I'll let people in as they come.
okay. I'm going to just duck out for one moment to take care of a little bookkeeping, and I will be right back, okay? All right.
I was going to add real quickly, one of the exciting things is that Carolyn and Jeremy, in so many other panels, there's like 2 to 3 levels of separations from the audience. So this is a rare treat that I think like for the audience as well, that we'll be able to engage in some questions that in other cases we're not able to see.
Yeah, and Sarah Linda will talk more. You guys are welcome to put your questions in the chat throughout the program, and then we'll open the floor to questions later as well.
Yeah, so this is, hi, sorry, welcome, welcome back. I mean, welcome me back. I just wanted to mention, as you said, that you will be muted, and please do put your questions in the chat. I'm glad that, that our speakers feel comfortable seeing everybody because we really do want this to be an organic conversation. This is, just to make sure you're in the right place, this is talking with author, activist, and artist about access. And this program, which is generously supported by Art Bridges, is in celebration of Black History Month. We've invited Dr. Carolyn Finney, author of the book Black Faces, White Spaces, and a scholar in residence at Middlebury College in Vermont, Jose Gonzalez, founder and former executive director for Latino Outdoors, and currently a partner at Avarna, and Jeremy Dennis, an artist of Shinnecock origin, who has loaned photographs from his series on this site that document ancient sacred tribal lands to the exhibition to share their unique and representative perspectives on these questions and their implications for racial and environmental justice in this virtual conversation, inspired by the exhibition Landscape Art and Virtual Travel, which is on exhibit right now at the Hudson River Museum. You could see it in person, and it will be up through August 8th of this year. So everyone on this call and your friends and family, please do visit us. And we also have been having and will continue to have virtual tours of the exhibition. As a matter of fact, there is one coming up later this month on the 24th, which will be hosted by our docents. So at a time when the pandemic has forced us to redefine tourism, Landscape Art and Virtual Travel celebrates artists' striking ability to transport us to real and imaginary places. The 19th to 21st century artworks that are on view in the exhibit shed light on the power of artists to influence our ideas and actions regarding our relationship to nature and how to protect it. But the exhibition also demonstrates some of the ways in which Native Americans, African Americans, Latino, and other marginalized people have historically been denied ownership and connection to the American soil. So we have gathered together 3 distinguished speakers, and I'm going to give a short introduction about each one of them in the order in which they will be speaking to you. First, we have Carolyn Finney, PhD, who is a storyteller, author, and cultural geographer. She is deeply interested in issues related to identity, difference, creativity, and resilience. Carolyn is grounded in both artistic and intellectual ways of knowing. She pursued an acting career for 11 years, but 5 years of backpacking trips through Africa and Asia and living in Nepal changed the course of her life. Motivated by these experiences, Carolyn returned to school after a 15-year absence to complete a BA, MA, and PhD. And along with public speaking, writing, media engagements, consulting, and teaching, she served on the U.S. National Parks Advisory Board for 8 years. Her first book, Black Faces, White Spaces, Reimagining the Relationship of African Americans to the Great Outdoors, was released in 2014. Her recent publications include Self-Evident, Reflections on the Invisibility of Black Bodies in Environmental Histories, The Perils of Being Black in Public, We Are All Christian Cooper and George Floyd. And she is currently working on a performance piece about John Muir, The N-Word, Nature Revisited. After Carolyn, we are going to hear from Jeremy Dennis, who is a contemporary fine art photographer and a tribal member of the Shinnecock Indian Nation in Southampton, New York. In his work, he explores Indigenous identity, culture, and assimilation. Dennis was one of 10 recipients of a 2016 Dreamstarter grant from the national nonprofit organization Running Strong for American Indian Youth. He was awarded $10,000 to pursue his project on this site, which uses photography and an interactive online map to showcase culturally significant Native American sites on Long Island. This is a topic of special meaning for Dennis, who was raised on the Shinnecock Nation Reservation. He also created a book and exhibition from this project. And most recently, Dennis received the Creative Bursar Award from Getty Images in 2018 to continue his series Stories. And as I mentioned, 2 of his photographs are on loan to the museum in the exhibition Landscape Art and Virtual Travel. Dennis holds an MFA from Pennsylvania State University, State College, Pennsylvania, and a BA in Studio Art from Stony Brook. He currently lives and works in Southampton, New York, on the Shinnecock Indian Reservation. And finally, we'll hear from Jose Gonzalez, a professional educator with training in the fields of education and conservation, while engaging in different artistic endeavors with art and messaging, often exploring the intersection of the environment and culture. He is the founder and director emeritus of Latino Outdoors, a nonprofit that connects and engages Latinx communities in the outdoors. Jose plays with design, words, science, and education, engaging in the interdisciplinary intersections of how we view and engage with the world. Be it a piece of art, poem, or scientific fact, Jose likes to weave ideas with people while appreciating the beauty of it all. Currently as a partner in the Avarna group and through his own consulting, his work focuses on equity and inclusion frameworks and practices in the environmental, outdoor, and conservation fields. He's been recognized with several honors, including the National Wildlife Federation Environmental Educator Award. And also you may have seen him in various outdoor spaces or read his poetic musings. He received his BA at the University of California, Davis, and his MS at the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and Environment. So now that you have a little background on our speakers, I want to get started with the conversation. And as we said earlier, please feel free to put your comments and questions in the chat, because after we've heard from each individual, we want to have a conversation. And I'm really, really excited to see how it develops. I'm going to kick off this conversation before I hand it to Carolyn with the question of who belongs in the landscape? Who belongs in the landscape? Where and how? Carolyn, let's hear from you.
Okay, because I got something to say about that. First of all, hi to everybody that's here today. I'm excited about this conversation. And thank you, Sarah, Linda, and Olivia for inviting me to be a part of this. I'll pretty much do anything that Jose is a part of. And now that I know Jeremy, I think I feel the same way about that. So I'm really happy to be here today and having this conversation. I also want to I'm really working to improve my I want to acknowledge that I'm here in Burlington, Vermont, and this is the traditional land of the Abenaki. And so I want to make sure that I say that in sort of my own practice, because sometimes I forget. My privilege gets in the way. Yeah, so here's the thing that I want to do coming to that question is I don't come at this from an intellectual. I use the intellect to think about it, but really this is personal, it's professional, who belongs, it's intimate, and it's changing over time. So I'm just gonna put a couple of slides here about where I grew up in New York, where I was born and raised, and talk about it, but just for a few minutes to give you some sense of my own bias. And for me, we're all biased, which isn't the same as prejudice, but I have a point of view about this because I feel a way about that question, who belongs, especially here in this country, in the United States, both historically and in this moment. I'm hitting share screen. Let me see. Yeah, let's start here because that's just fun. It's not even, and the question of who belongs for me is connected to whose story counts. And I say this, yeah, that's me. This is way back in the olden days of 1962. And I was born in New York City. My parents, who were originally from Floyd, Virginia, very poor, had moved north in the 50s and got a job caring for a 12-acre estate 30 minutes outside of New York in Westchester County, in Mamaroneck, New York. And it was owned by a very wealthy Jewish family, and they had to move on the estate, became the caretakers, the gardeners, the chauffeur, the sometime housekeeper for this estate. They thought they couldn't have kids. They adopted me, and then they relaxed a bit and had my two brothers. And so I just want to show you some pictures of this estate that you can see my parents there when they were really young. You start to see the gardeners. That's the gardener's cottage that we lived in. You see a little bit of the trees there. This is what I call the big house where the owners came to on weekends and holidays. There was a pool. There was a small pond with fish, fruit trees, vegetable gardens, flower gardens. And, one of the things that I always say is that nature as itself outside of ourselves is beautiful on its own. But on this estate, the other half of that was my parents' labor, because that was their job 24/7 to take care of this space. There's a whole longer story here that I actually don't want to tell simply because I want our conversation to open up a bit. But part of the way my response to the question of who belongs is the sense that the only reason we were on this land is because my parents could work from it. We could never have afforded it. It's around $3 million to be on this land in a very wealthy, all-white neighborhood. Harry Winston and others like that had the money to have land in this place. My parents cared for this land for nearly 50 years. I'm going to show you a couple of this is my parents, but I want to show you a couple of other pictures of this land. Just sort of stunning place to be, where they were at all the time on this land. When the original owners died, the land got sold. My parents stayed on to 2003. When they left that land, when they had to leave, the original owners had a house built for them in Leesburg, Virginia, which is where they moved back to. I watched my father get depressed in particular. He talks about missing the land. But in terms of the answer to the question, who belongs on this land? A conservation easement was placed on this land after they moved. And they received a letter around 2009. My parents moved in 2003. They've been on the land for nearly 50 years. They moved to their new house that was on a half an acre of land. My father in particular missed this land. He talked about legacy. He talked about this was home for us as a family. I got a copy of that letter from the Westchester Land Trust, letting everyone know in the area that a conservation easement was now placed on this 12 acres, which means in perpetuity, nothing can be changed. It talked about all the environmental values of this property, the wildlife, where it sits in the watershed, the importance of protecting it over time. At the end of this letter, which is about a page and a half long, it thanked the new owner for his conservation mindedness. The new owner had been on the land at that point for maybe 3-5 years, not very long. There was nothing in the letter thanking my parents who'd been on the land for nearly 50 years. And just like that, they're erased from the history. And that's really the point for me back in 2003, I started thinking about not just my family, but all the people in the history of this country, but particularly brown and Black people whose labor, whose love, whose presence has been a part of the land And I want to take, who belongs on the land, because of course in this country, for me, that's connected to the idea of ownership, which gets really complicated because then there's this whole thing about private and public, public land versus private. So if you have enough money, you can buy the land. But all the people who have always been present there, even when they are no longer alive or no longer living on that property, I believe that their blood is in that soil in a very particular way. But how easy it is for that story to be erased. And not because the people in the land trust, I think, are bad people. I just don't go into these conversations thinking that. But this is for me where privilege has the privilege of not seeing itself, and the ease within which certain people get erased from that story. So the question of who belongs, I don't even know how to answer that. Who gets to decide who belongs? What's the narrative? For me, part of that who belongs to the landscape is connected to the idea of a national narrative in this country about who we are collectively as a nation. And you all know we are having that conversation out loud in a way that we haven't had it out loud in a long time. It's complicated, but it's complicated because it's always been complicated and complex, in part because I think we've used a universal narrative. We take the privileged position of a few, we tell the story of manifest destiny, this is who we are, and it's not that that story is not true, but it is not a universal story. Actually, you can talk to probably any Native person, Black person, Asian person, Latinx person, that keep going down the line, who's probably going to have a slightly different telling of that story, which again, it's not about one or the other, it's a broader, for me, it's a broader tapestry of experience and what we privilege and how we privilege that complexity. So yeah, I'm kind of caught up in this in a very particular way because we don't have access to this land. Our story isn't connected to it, even though I'm working on a project I'm working on now is to reinstate my family story in a very particular way here on that land. And then, I don't know, there's something for me lately. I've been really, all you need is to have a lot of money and you can buy it and the land is yours. So that means you belong to it because it belongs to you. That's really complicated. I mean, if we go back to, the idea that you can own it as opposed to belong to it or be in a relationship with it, what do we privilege in terms of how we even frame that relationship in the first place? And I'm going to stop there. Because I kind of want to hand it over to Jeremy and see what he's got to say about the situation.
Well, thank you, Carolyn, and
Sure.
thank you, Sarah, Linda, and Olivia. I completely agree with what you presented, and I really enjoyed the story that you told. I'll share my screen too, just to share very briefly about my project and give a little bit of context or visual aid. A lot of people and institutions, libraries, educators have been using this map, nativeland.ca, which is a public resource for land acknowledgement. So if I go to my home, you can kind of see a sense of Long Island, New York. You can click on some of these different shapes, and it kind of gives you a great sense of what are the traditional lands of these places before colonization. And so I'm going to go to my project on this site, which I started in 2016. And it really kind of takes that idea that nativeland.ca is doing, but it over time, I finally have been able to kind of do a similar design to what they're doing. I really love the idea that you can use technology and connect all of these very modern things like Google Maps with history that happened 10,000 years ago. And so as Sarah Linda mentioned, this is a project that looks at that 10,000 years of Indigenous presence here on Long Island. On the mainland, it's up to 150,000 years, but because of the geography and how the island was made, we've been here for 10,000 years. And so a lot of the project involves going to different sites, as a photographer, documenting what it looks like today, and just trying to bring awareness to a lot of these different sites. And since Carolyn shared her home and her background, I'll share my home as well. This is a Shinnecock Indian Reservation, our community center. And I think if I click on it, you can get a better sense of what it looks like. On the right side is my mom's mural. I've always been proud of that, painted in the 90s. But we're a very small community. And if I go back to the map, I actually made a little outline for the Shinnecock Reservation. And then I also made a much broader yellow polygon or shape for what our traditional land once looked like. And so it is amazing to be a Native person, be able to visually see what was either our land at one point, or what was our land and stolen from us, or unceded lands. And so this is just one way to interact with it, and you can click on different pinpoints. Or there's this button at the top that says browse by images, and I think a lot of people just love, it's almost kind of like a contact sheet of negatives where you can see an image, you can see a caption, you can use your Control F on your keyboard to find a specific site. And I think there's about 100 so far. But I'll stop sharing now and try to address the question of who belongs and questions of access. And so working on my project on this site, this became a big issue because so many different landscapes are on private lands, whether that's kind of industrial government facilities, private landowners and their residences. And so a lot of the work that I've been doing is just trying to balance whether or not I kind of want to trespass in order to tell these accurate stories of change, of colonization, of land seizure or land displacement. And so I think in a more general sense, as Carolyn mentioned, the whole idea of private land and gated land is questionable. It's part of the whole issues of capitalism and colonization as a continued kind of institution. But one thing that we especially suffer from on the east end of Long Island is the fact that people specifically develop these huge McMansions, as they call them. They occupy them for about 2 weeks in the entire year. And more what we think of as public land or accessible land or affordable housing, just kind of communal spaces have been transformed and taken away, just so people, just a handful of people can build up their assets and increase their land value. So I'll pass it to Jose, and I want to learn more as well.
Thank you so much, Jeremy and Carolyn, and of course to Sarah, Linda, and Olivia, and then the Hudson River Museum at large. So I will, I guess, true to my introduction, I'll add a little bit of weaving in terms of what Carolyn and Jeremy have presented. First of all, hello everyone, Jose Gonzalez, or full disclosure, Jose Guadalupe Adonis Gonzalez Rosales de Leon. That's a story in and of itself. He, him, his, although I'll respond in respect, and I'm greeting you all from the traditional, ancestral, stolen and unceded lands of the Southern Maidu, Miwok, among many others, in what is at the moment Sacramento, California, so the West Coast. And what I'll share is a couple of the components in terms of what, for me, that question, who belongs in this land, and all these other elements of then who doesn't, and what does ownership mean, and how do we unpack land. You know, there's so many ways that I approach this, and I've been trying to be much more intentional about this idea of healing and restoring a severed connection to land, to nature, to ourselves within that process. And so when I say who belongs is all of us in our radical revolutionary selves, and that even in the investigation of those words for me is that the root of radical is root, right? So like, how are we returning to a root? And so radical isn't this far outlier, it's actually pretty central. So when I say our radical revolutionary selves is this way to kind of say how we can be nature-centered and revolutionary with this idea of revolution of cycles. And I think about the cycles in nature, and how it's pretty clear that when we disrupt those, the harm that comes from that. Climate change, of course, being the big one. You disrupt the carbon cycle, that has consequences. But I think about a lot of other natural cycles we've disconnected from, disassociated from, have forgotten, have been disrupted. And what does that mean to then be revolutionary by reconnecting to that? And as has been mentioned, when we then get all of these terms, right, with colonization, supremacy, all of the, a lot of the isms of harm. So I look at this interconnection system of harm that can help us kind of pack out what's the bad. So this is from Dr. Rupia Maria, that kind of, she presented this graphic as she was looking at this idea of trauma, both as in her practice as a medical doctor, but then being able to say, but what's the trauma that's also may not be physical trauma, but we're carrying it, and that it comes from a lot of these things. And this is kind of what Michelle Holliday was saying, that even a step back was this mechanistic reductionist worldview, which I think we begin to see how it's permeated a lot of our relationships, how it's reductive, how then land is a thing, the tree is a resource, merely only a resource of an object. And we do this with people too, right? That creates the logics and the justifications for how we can treat something in a way that's bad. And so flipping that was this idea then, what are we, in addition to the proverbial master's house that we're tearing down, what are the houses that we're building? Like, what are the elements in terms of the systems of healing, the systems of restoration, here that Michelle Holiday presents, which to me, it's a lot of nature language. It's a lot of the language of ecology. This is what can help us in terms of our social justice work. And so for me, that's helpful because it's a way to also say all of us involved in nature, conservation, environmental type of work. Sometimes we think social justice is this foreign language that's coming in, that revolutionary means is these outliers and quote unquote, affecting our space, when really we should have clear ownership. This should be rooted in the work that we do. And so what I'll close is, I've been then using this as engagement points, so that if we talk about conflict, for example, I'm saying like, oh, we got to be overly suppressive of conflict. And I'm saying, well, what did we learn about fire management in that way? And how overly suppressive of fire is actually harmful, and the value of prescribed burning, which is also an ancestral traditional practice. And now we're like reconnecting to that. So then I think, what is the prescribed burning that we should be having in our relationships, so that we are setting the context for healthy succession, because some things may need to burn. And with the ecotone, right, this where our respective habitats come together, that's a zone of abundance, rather than how sometimes as humans we treat edges as these hard boundaries, like our border wall. And that this isn't new. Like a lot of the work, this comes from a National Science Foundation study of the cosmic serpent, being able to say, let's look at what happens when we include these other ways of knowing, rather than solely relying on a Western Eurocentric worldview that maybe has dominated the perspective of how we value things, that comes from that kind of Renaissance Enlightenment method that only said that the only way to engage with the tree is by counting it, measuring it, let's label it, let's give it its classification. And this is how, Dr. Robin Walkim was saying, well, what does it also look to have a responsibility with it, to have an interdependence, to be in community with it, rather than just in extraction or resource. And my last two slides here, I put this because this isn't just kind of like the schematic stuff. This isn't just like the philosophical shifting in perspective. It's yes, we need to do that. And that this has direct implication, right? When we talk who belongs in the land, is then we can't just say who do we exclude out. So this comes from the 2017 Nature of American Studies. And I like these two slides because it can give you that contrast and that invitation to question what we mean by some of these things, like outdoors, nature, and what are the norms we reinforce and the expectations that we have. So when you look at this and it says interest in hiking lowest amongst Black adults. So when you look at who's identifying here as interest in hiking for a lot, the Black identity is at 19%, right? That's really low. The Hispanic identity is at 45%. But if you ask the question as interest in walking outdoors, all of a sudden they all go up. And it makes me wonder, what's the difference between hiking and walking outdoors? How is it that you can have different responses to that? And that in the walking outdoors component, you look at the Black identity here and it's at 55%. And so that's, for me, is the exciting part of having conversations to this, because we get to interrogate some of that. So I'll stop there and we'll be ready to jump in.
Jose, thank you so much, and Carolyn and Jeremy as well. There is so much to unpack in what you have said in terms of your relationship to that question of who belongs in the landscape. One thing that struck me in particular was how personal this question is to all of you. You know, when we talked about what to title this talk, we're talking with an author, activist, and artist, but you're all activists. So what I want to know is if you would address the question of how you may have been conditioned to perceive your own relationship to nature and that of others, and how that conditioning has informed your activism, and what you feel your responsibility and contribution is to connecting marginalized communities to the landscape.
Yeah, that's an interesting. Sorry, it's because to be conditioned is, you know, it kind of gave me a weird feeling. Like it's a very particular term. Conditioned implies for me that I don't have any control, and I think that's somewhat true, right? Because part of the conditioning is when I was a child, based on I go to school. Here's what you have to read about the environment. Here's how we want you to talk about it. This is the, you know, all of that. There is some lack of control on my part. And actually, I do have agency. So there's also the experience I had of playing outside on that 12 acres every day, right? And stuff that I could not have put any language to, but it clearly informed me. It's like, I can't even believe that I'm spending all my life using that as the centerpiece of all the work I do. I could have never thought that would have happened, right? And there's something about my own attachment there and growing up there. And, you know, when I talk about at 9 getting stopped by a white policeman as I'm walking home from school in 4th grade, right around the corner from the house, he wants to know where I'm going. I tell him the address and he looks at me and says, "Oh, do you work there?" And I'm thinking, I'm 9, like I live there, what's going on? So the question of the color of my skin was also quite apparent. And I was conditioned as well by cultural behavior, as well as academic behavior, because cultural behavior like that of the policemen and others who might question my presence in a beautiful outdoor space like that, as well as what I learned where I saw nobody like me in the information being shared with me at school, which doesn't make the information being shared bad information, but it's really interesting when there's nobody who looks like me in there. And the comfort by which those sharing that knowledge use the we. The thing I always ask, and listening to all of us, and myself included, is who's the we are talking about? Who gets to decide what the information is and the stories are? Who gets to decide what the definitions that count are? The way we classify certain pieces of non-human nature, how we privilege Latin, you know, all these things get chosen. And I don't think they're bad things. But it's really interesting because other people had other ways of naming and claiming those relationships all the time. And yes, sometimes, this is just me being cynical for a moment, and I'm not cynical, but we appropriate that stuff because, it's cool to do it, even though it may have thousands of years behind it of experience and practice, right? And deep connection. I mean, the thing that I always think sometimes that some of us may be reluctant to say, that at the core of this is a love for and a love with all, you know, whether it's humanity, non-human nature, the land. My father doesn't go around saying, my father is hardcore old school, doesn't show vulnerability, a challenging human being. He will never say that he loves the land. Well, I can never say he never. He has Alzheimer's now, so he's saying things he would have never said before. So he might say it. But the fact of his missing it so deeply, and probably it's a complicated relationship because that's how he was able to put food on the table, you know, because when the owners would ring a bell that on the side of the house, he had to come running because that's what he had to do 24/7. He was out there 24/7 on that land, which didn't mean he didn't love it less. So at the core of this is also, for me, the agency to define what our relationship is and the agency to decide what we want it to be. So when I think about conditioning, like, you know, really these last maybe 6, 8 years, when I decided that I wanted to do this work in a really public way to answer that question, it's a journey for me. It actually has little to do with whether or not I got any educational degrees or how many things I may have written. I realize at the heart of it, it's actually a way for me to talk about what I'm lacking, the relationship that's been severed, my lack of, I'll say my lack of um, the challenge to actually engage it in the larger conversation and make space for it. I was watching a documentary the other day, and follow me for just a second. It was on HBO. It was called Black Art, in the Absence of Light. And it was looking at the history of Black artists and how you've got an art industry where 85% of the artists are white, 15% are artists of color, and 1.2 are African-American. If you think about it, that's kind of insane in terms of, that doesn't mean the artists aren't there. It's almost like the question in the chart that Jose put up. It's just that the question that you're asking and how we affirm and we decide what counts and what the story is, even the structures around it condition us in such a way that we forget what our imagination is. And if we happen to look like and embody those experiences that aren't fully seen, my God, the next thing you know, we're looking in the mirror and think we can't even see ourselves, like we don't have a place. And how we think about, when I was interviewing Black people for the book Black Faces, White Spaces, especially older Black people, when I'd ask them the questions, and it's funny, it's very things that Jose was pointing to, I would say, so when I say environment, what does it mean to you? When I say outdoors, what does it mean to you? When I say park, I can't tell you how many of them, especially the older ones, said, nobody's ever asked me that before. And then they had an answer, because everybody has a point of view and experience and a story. But the thing that struck me and actually hurt me a little bit, like in the heart, like nobody's ever asked me that before. And then they tell some amazing story. Or when they say, I don't have a story about it. And I'm like, you're breathing, you got a story, right? I mean, so that conditioning, one, that we're separate, human beings are separate from non-human nature, and that's a conditioning. And two, that some people have been conditioned to believe they're not in the story, and what they know and experience and feel has no value in the story. Oh my God, stop me now while you can. Jeremy, Jose.
I'll jump in very briefly. I agree with what Carolyn and Jose have presented. I think in America and in the West, we see ourselves as above nature, or we have to control nature, or we're separate because of our consciousness. I think the big thing that you see in the news now is a drive to, especially billionaires who have all the money, trying to launch different space exploration missions as if, oh, we don't like the nature here, or we kind of screwed up, so we can just go to Mars, and I'm sure there'll be grass and air and water there for us waiting. But I think that's just a symptom of our still continued view of nature as something that's separate, something controllable. And as my project on this site, I'm hoping to just focus more on Earth and preserve natural landscapes by looking at cultural places. So by working with local towns, we're able to actually focus on what's still here, what we can still save. And as a Native person, the whole idea of what we're conditioned to see or believe is a big question because I think back to, even though I was born after the time, Iron Eyes Cody, the Italian-American actor who played the Crying Indian, that's still in all of our popular minds about Native people. And here at Shinnecock, we just constructed two 3-story LCD screens called Shinnecock monuments. And so many people came out in opposition, mostly because they think Native Americans are just out there picking berries and harvesting deers. They don't live in modern housing. And so the whole idea of like, how do we condition ourselves to see others or Native people is a big theme in my work and my thinking. And I think about 2016 and the Dakota Access Pipelines as a big shift in terms of how we see ourselves, how we see nature, and especially how we see Native people. So I'll pass it on to Jose.
No, totally. And thank you. Yeah, I mean, in all honesty, there's so much. so many points of engagement have been provided. And when I think about that word, I say conditioning, Sarah Linda, there's a sense of, an aspect of culture is what is comfortable and familiar, or lets you fit in. And then what are the cues that affirm or punish you for that, to say, that's not how we do this, or yeah, good job, you're doing that. So think of that conditioning component. And at least in terms of, there's a way that individually, as Carolyn mentioned, we kind of have to wrestle that if we don't investigate it. So we'll take the cues to be able to say, oh, okay, if I'm going hiking, this is what it's supposed to look like. Or that I need to have my REI membership. I need to make sure that it's a branded piece of clothing, because that'll let me know that I fit in. And so for me, that started early. I'm an immigrant from Mexico. So that was a very quick example of coming to the yes and beginning to kind of see what fit is and not, and unpacking that whole journey, as Carolyn mentioned, because it's hard for, I can't answer the question, I'm from the US, and yet I can say, and I am with this land in ways that modern borders have told me I'm not. And yet, as I unpacked that for myself, I was like, whoa, as a Latino, here's the way that I'm colonizer and colonized. I have these roots from the Spanish, now these roots from the native communities that are throughout that. And it also allowed me to unpack to say the Uto Aztecan language connected Utah to central Mexico. It's this sense of like the history that Jeremy's talking about, that's the next level of conditioning that we culturally would be able to say, here's what we agree to continue to carry, and here's what we will no longer tell. And a lot of erasure, and especially indigenous erasure, like that's what it is. That's a reason why it's important to name the land and use the words, not just because something we're supposed to say, but it's because it's the perfect example of trying to do the opposite of what has been done before. And how we we historicize or dehistoricize component. And I'll close by saying then the larger type of conditioning, of course, comes with the levels and systems, the levers and systems of power. So the institutional components that then allocate resources to kind of say, this is important, this is not important. This is why we protect this as a public land. And and when we say public land, we mean it was empty. So it's okay to do this, rather than like, let's not talk about the fact of who was here before and why they're no longer here, so that we can feel better about our protection of the spaces, as Carolyn's mentioned. So just like I think about all of the navigation of all of that, and what makes it sound kind of scary and maybe challenging, like, how do we do all this? But that's why I put those visuals to kind of say, I get inspired as well by our potential to imagine and to move in that radical imagination of how we can change things.
Thank you all for that, all of you. And I do want to, before I go into any other questions, because I mean, the idea of how human beings tend to colonize nature, just in terms of controlling boundaries in order to control populations. I mean, that's one area I would love for you to kind of tease out. Carolyn, the sense of agency versus conditioning, I think, is really, really significant. And I know you've done work with national parks, and Jose's, Latino Outdoors has done a great deal of work in the community. And Jeremy, just that building behind you is connected to the land and the promise of the land, for not just for native populations, but in terms of the arts. So there are a number of different areas I would love for you to kind of go a little bit further on. But I do see that there is a comment in the chat from our curator. I think sometimes we think about the landscape as being somewhere else, somewhere we have to travel to, not where we are. I think that could create a dangerous disconnect as well as a barrier. I think in particular, that relates to the national parks question, and
Well,
the travel question, certainly. So,
so, yeah, sorry, I'll mention this real quickly, because that's when I said I'm an immigrant to this country, that's a perfect example
mhm,
of, I was born in a relatively rural town in Mexico. So just like some people sometimes talk about, growing up in farms in the US, so the outdoors was outside. It was just there. And I didn't think about it as like, oh, now I'm hiking, rather as I'm walking to school or I'm walking with my grandfather to his crop. And it was coming to the US that separation was a little bit more apparent. Now we did have to drive to the outdoors or to a park. And now it's where I first encountered this idea of a protected landscape in a particular way as a state park. It doesn't mean there aren't parks in Mexico. It's just where I grew up. That wasn't the thing that I saw. And so that was a clear example of me, for at least speaking for myself, how I began to hold a little bit of that duality and then expand from that.
And I want to, one of the thing that popped up for me was the question of mobility, that in the comment in the chat from your curator, yes, yes, sometimes I think we had that conversation that the landscape is something we go to and is not the thing that we're on. So a couple of things popped in my head. One, as a geographer, I think about scale and what scale are we speaking at, right? Are we speaking about, ourselves as the individual body and where it's at the moment? Are we thinking about community, national, state, international, global? I mean, the scale will change the way we understand that landscape. And in all cases, it points to our ability or our inability to move on that landscape, to be free on that landscape, how we move. So whether we're talking, what I'm hearing Jose talking about, immigrating here, crossing boundaries, and what those boundaries are, and sometimes they're obvious and sometimes they're not. Well, that's when I'm thinking about the Green Book and African Americans, the magazine, Ebony, which is still around, basically targets a sort of middle class, upper middle class African-American audience. And it's been around since the 40s. For many years, from about the mid 40s into the 60s, during the summer, there would always be a summer supplement that, where Black families could go to be in the outdoors. You could go hiking, camping, swimming, horseback riding. It was amazing. They'd have, and I know this because I looked at the library in Atlanta that had all of them, because I went through all of them. I said, I've never seen this before. My family used to get Ebony magazine, but by the 60s, they weren't having the summer supplement. But what was interesting about the summer supplement, you see all these images of Black families in the outdoors doing these outdoor recreational activities. There were also indications about, and here's the places where you can stay. And here's the places where you can go eat. Because, that was during Jim Crow segregation. So those things took up space equally. One wasn't hidden from the other. You understood that, yeah, you can do this, and you have to think about your mobility across the landscape, because there's also the historical landscape. There's the cultural landscape, right? There's, when we talk about, systemic racism, in part, it is at the roots of this. It's in there. It's just in there, whether we see it or not. And so landscape for me is also informed by, the things we can't see. It's informed by movement. It's informed by agency. It's informed by who we are and how we move, what a sign may mean. So if you see a whites only sign, what does that mean in relation to, for me, I've always said it makes no difference if you're talking about a beautiful beach, a mountain, or the woods, or a park. It makes no difference in that suddenly all of those things disappear and everybody can go to, be embedded in that landscape in a very particular way and feel that it is sublime. That is a construct, and that is from a very particular privileged perspective. I'm not making it a bad thing. I'm just saying that it doesn't allow for, if I can't fit into that, if Jose can't fit into that, if Jeremy can't, for a multitude of reasons, then we're the ones lacking, right? Then it becomes a question of our ability to create and continue to grow that relationship, not only to the land itself, but also to each other, in a relationship to that land becomes inhibited because we're not fully seen and we're confused. I should just speak for myself. And I'm confused about what it is I can do or not do, what's authentic, where do I still have to grow? The last thing I want to throw in there, oh, never mind, I'm gonna leave that alone. Okay, never mind. Go, Jeremy.
Well, thank you. I like that question, Laura. I think about it for my specific project, and just more generally with climate change. It's really crazy. I'm following people on social media who still have that need to go on planes and travel and like go to Puerto Rico from New York, and the whole idea that we can't enjoy the landscape unless we're going somewhere else is so valid. And so what's so special about on this site is that you actually don't have to go to a different country or a different state, take a flight. You can just rediscover some of the histories of what's right beside us, what we pass every day. And I think it's such an important concept that we just need to appreciate what we have around us. And I grew up and I still live on a Indian reservation. And I think this is a pretty popular study. According to the study, less than 5% of the world's population is indigenous people, but they protect 80% of the global biodiversity. And so I wake up every day and there's like a pack of deer, there might be a crane or some other really crazy species of animal right outside my window. And I think about the difference between how we are stewards of the land. And if you go to Southampton, our local town, they actually have to have nature preserves. They have to have strict rules to make sure people developing know not to just totally destroy nature. So it's a different mindset. And I think in order to kind of save the environment, indigenous people definitely have to lead with their indigenous knowledge.
Can I add something? I know it's your turn now, Jose, because I want to point to something Jeremy just said. Jose's like, I can't stop you. You're there in Zoom. So I just want to say, one of the things that you made me think of is this, what I heard, Jeremy, and how I interpreted it was, depth as opposed to breadth. And I have to, be transparent, is I love traveling. I'm normally on a plane every week. Travel, all that 5 years is what got me back to thinking about these things. And I realize in part it's where I come most alive, because I have an attachment to the freedom of mobility. And that's this whole deep psychological thing we can have at another time. That in part, that's part of the drive and the deep desire to seek and connect and reach out, beyond the boundaries of my own body, right? To know what that is as well and not be limited by that. And a class I just started teaching at Middlebury, I created, where I have students first do their environmental autobiography about a piece of land. They can't get the exercise wrong. So whatever it is you want to talk about and how you came to your own relationship. And then after they do the initial assignment, the whole rest of the semester is, and now you got to dig deep. So now you got to go back. You can go far back as you want, but you have to discover what you don't know about that place so that there's real depth to it. So it's a different kind of trip to take. And that's what I wanted to throw in there. Okay.
No, and I think that's a good example though, Carolyn, as you're mentioning, right? It isn't an when you look at the big pictures, it's always a concern about beware the binary, right? Because it's an example of being able to say what is a much more spectrum way of acknowledging and considering, even with outdoor engagement, to avoid the pyramid, to say like, well, this at the top up here, that's the best kind of outdoor experiences. That's the go to the top of the mountain and have that faraway wilderness. And then the bottom one is all your nearby nature, rather like it's a spectrum. They can all have its validity. But the reason I'm mentioning that is because, with traveling, it is that consideration to be able to say, how have we been impacted in ways that it's helpful to try to unpack that based on history and the systems. So when I use a phrase like Black joy and liberation and Native knowledge and sovereignty, it isn't because there isn't Native joy and liberation, and that there isn't Black knowledge and sovereignty. It's to try to have a focus point to be able to say it's because of the history that acutely repress these kind of components. So in terms of a Black body, that was heavily constricted in terms of your agency. So maybe it can help you understand why this idea of mobility and agency and freedom resonates in particular ways, and for Native sovereignty, because that has been a clear example of how that has been acutely attacked and restricted and constrained. So that's how I see it, because sometimes people say, well, what about this communities? I'm like, yes, and we need you to kind of pay attention as to like the intention of what's being stated.
And I really want to reflect on something that I think is implied here is, this whole idea about being intersectional. So that as Jose was talking, I was like, yes, the freedom of mobility and my deep, need for that independence and freedom around that is in part driven by both this racial history, and it's also a gender thing. I realize, it's a lot of things up in there that have got me pointing to it. And I think that's probably true for many of us in terms of we're a multitude of things, and we're influenced in multiple ways. And so, yeah.
Wow. So we're almost at the hour mark, but there's so many more questions that I have, and I hope that will come from our audience. I did want to point out the comment that Liz Rodriguez, one of our docents, made in the chat about the construction of inner city housing projects as an intentional way, boundary from accessing the landscape. Even if you wanted to visit the landscape, you couldn't because the bridges were too low. So buses couldn't help you access those spaces unless you had a car. And all of those implications sociologically and economically. I had two other questions that, unless you guys have questions you want to ask each other or points that you want to make. So it's your choice. One was about who you see as the custodians of the land, of the landscape, and what responsibilities and privileges that role confers. And I know that's been touched upon already in our conversation about the protection of the land by Indigenous people. The other question I had, and maybe more current of a question, is about how the past year, about how the pandemic and COVID has affected our relationship to the landscape in a personal way and in a universal way, because I think we're talking, on both levels at the same time. Has our relationship to the land changed because of the restrictions put upon us by the pandemic?
Those are both great questions. So that was my,
that
was my private inner scream that wasn't so private. So I'm going to go back to take the second one first, COVID. And I can only speak for myself, right? I mean, there's something, my work is normally 70% of the time getting invitations and going to do this work out in the world. And I normally, like I said, was saying to everyone, I would have been on a plane every week. COVID really stopped that. And for a minute, I watched 70% of my opportunity income vanish. And then Christian Cooper walked into Central Park and had his skin weaponized against him, and George Floyd was murdered. And then I watched everything, my work exploded. I mean, I can't even, there is no, the conversations have exploded in a very particular way. And so the question of, particularly around race and the environment, power and privilege, who belongs, who doesn't, COVID-19 has not only opened that up for me to think about it and do it while being in place, and which has been my own personal challenge of thinking about that depth I often talk about and what does it mean in a place that I only just moved here. And I have mixed feelings about it, and that's not meant to be bad or good, I just do. But it is a place that considers itself this outdoors in the more traditional sense of how it's been constructed, Vermont, it's a very beautiful place, right, in its own way, depending on how you define outdoor beauty. I think that COVID-19 has allowed for this conversation. We're having it more often in a much more public way. Many of us, like the three of us, I imagine that's how our work is informed. We've been having it. And I've just really seen it exploded because the people reaching out to me to have these conversations, some of these organizations and businesses and stuff weren't having it before, even though I was saying the same thing. You know, we were saying it was there, the conversation's been there for a long time. So I think there's a real opportunity. We've heard it called the reckoning. There's all this ways of sort of perfect storm of the pandemic. Systemic racism is a very public conversation. An election that has revealed or further revealed and affirmed a division that, in my opinion, has always been there for over 450 years, has brought that to the fore in a very particular way, which has given us greater language, greater courage, you know, for some of us to say a thing. It's very hard. I think it's much harder to pretend you don't feel anything in this moment because you've been impacted on some level in some way, more than likely. And, you know, the climate change, all that is still there in the air. The question of who are the custodians, for me, it made me kind of go, like, not at you, Sarah Linda, but like, what do you mean? Like, what? First I thought, aren't we all? And wait a minute, custodians infers. There's so much inference there that there is an ownership inference. There is an inference for me, the way that I hear it as, so one group has more responsibility because what? They have a greater, longer history, because they have more money or more power, or because of the color of their skin. How do we decide who that is? Is that the metric we're using? Because that's the metric we've been using for 450 years in this country. And really, don't we know that that metric doesn't work? Everything we're saying here is really problematic. So, you know, for me, I would frame it as not who are the custodians, but it comes back to what some of us have been saying. You know, what is the relationship that we aspire to? What is the relationship we aspire to? What's the set of intentions we have to build that relationship? In the question of kinship, what does that look like? Both human to human and human to non-human. You know, how do we redefine, use different language? You know, what is that place, that chart that Jose put up, you know, that kind of, I saw it as an aspiration, you know, as a different way of framing and understanding ourselves in the world. It is philosophical. Because, you know, this is about deep thought in order to have big vision. And so what is the practices in place for us to be able to do that? Because aren't we all responsible? Aren't we all responsible? That's what and what does that responsibility look like for me compared to Jeremy, compared to Jose, compared to Sarah Linda? You know, I don't know that it's all the same. And in part, we have the agency to make those decisions for ourselves and decide. About a week and a half ago, I met this amazing man. We were in a conversation together online, a Black man named Sam Grant, who's the executive director of 350.org in Minneapolis. And he talked about how we all need to come to our edge and stand there with the open heart, sort of the idea of radical vulnerability, which is something I've been really exploring, you know, is not going to be the same for each of us. I can't ask people who've probably been traumatized to be more vulnerable, but it is about figuring out where is our edge in this conversation. If you're comfortable, you're not doing the work. This isn't about anybody's comfort, because a lot of us have never been comfortable, which doesn't mean you shouldn't be feeling safe, but they're not the same thing. So the question of who are the custodians, everybody's got to come to that on their own, because who is the we, and we are all responsible. And you can decide on what that is. Are you responsible for where you are right now? Are you responsible for something larger than that? What is the leverage you have with your own privilege? What is the leverage that you can leverage? So, you know, we all have power, just not the same power in the same way at the same time. What does that power look like? Is it about money, resources, access, the people that you know, the places that you're at? This is that moment. And how do we break out of, I'm going to say it, institutions that have become so rigid, not the people inside it, you know, but the institutions have become so rigid that they say, this is what we want to do, but are unwilling to change anything in order to do it, because they want us to assimilate to that, which doesn't get us any farther down the road. So my latest thing, and the last thing I'll say is, you don't have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. Everything we've learned, everything we know, I'm not interested in canceling anybody out. I don't think it's about that, you know, like, you know, Jose was saying, it's not about recreating a pyramid, a hierarchy of who knows more and who's better. But you definitely need to get a new bathtub. And that becomes part of our responsibility when we start thinking about how we all can be better in better relationship to this place we call home. Woosah.
Okay, thank you, thank you. Would anyone like to follow up on that? Jeremy?
I'll jump in briefly, just to agree with Carolyn, and I'll start with the COVID and my project. A lot of the time I ask myself, what do you do with a map? And for me, I want it to be sort of an invitation to the landscape. And so eventually this map is going to be so densely populated, and it kind of begs the question, what can we do now that we have all this knowledge, all this pretty much like the X on the map? So I'm hoping that Shinnecock and other Indigenous people of Long Island and New York City and beyond can come together at some of these places to reactivate them and re-engage in our ceremonies. But now that we're all working from home, another aspect is you can't really like go to the store to spend your leisurely time, and we're all sitting at the desk so much. I think we're all looking at landscape during COVID as kind of a break or relaxation, or get some of our anxieties out. But here at Shinnecock, we've actually rethought our connection with the landscape. We want to become more self-reliant through agriculture, because one thing we saw early on in COVID was a lack of resources because of how much we're reliant on industry and manufacturing. And so we had to import much of our food, and we had shortages and a lot of fear. So we're hoping to get more into farming. But as far as the question of custodians, I would agree with Carolyn. You can't just have like Indigenous people be the stewards of the land. Like 5% of the population care about the environment. And you also can't have people stereotyping environmentalists as hippies or something like that, or tree huggers. So I think we all have a role, certainly. I really love the Indigenous concept of the 7 generations, the idea that what you're doing now is going to affect people 7 generations from you. And I think that's something that a lot of, I guess, capitalists or materialists don't understand. They don't understand that if you put oil into the Gulf of Mexico, or if a pipeline breaks, like they still have money and they still have material wealth, but they aren't seeing beyond their own access and benefits. So I'll pass it to Jose.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll be pithy too, being mindful of the time. Again, there's so many fantastic points of engagement. I'll start with that expression, right? That some people start with "I have rights" rather than "I have responsibilities." And what happens when you start the other way? Say, "I have responsibilities" before you have rights. And so, because then that, to me, as Carolyn was mentioning, and Jeremy was also mentioning, in terms of this idea of custodians and stewardship and what those words mean. And I think it's that still an investigation and invitation to explore the relationship. Because then I think it's like, you know, how's the beaver a custodian of the landscape? How's the wolf a custodian of the landscape? And how do we value that? Again, when we look at, you know, through science, we learn that, hey, maybe it was a bad idea to remove the wolf from Yellowstone. Now let's put it back in and look what happens to a healthy landscape. And we still got to have our human debates around it. But it's like the landscape is still in its regenerative cycles. And then I ask, are we in our own regenerative cycles or not? So with the pandemic, I think it's we often express that it's been an amplifier and magnifier of what was already there, especially inequities. So what's already broken just became more visible. Things that weren't working are just that more notable, and it can serve as a portal, like an invitation to step into what it can be. And the concern is that for some, it's you know, we won't take the step. This idea of let's go back to normal instead is like, I want the comfort of how it was for me, rather than I'm facing this discomfort as an invitation for growth. And because that is what physical discomfort is, growth, but often we don't say, time to go put my body in a physical state of discomfort. Usually you say, time to go hit the gym, time to go for my trail run, time to like go work out. So there's that component. And I'll close with these other 2 things, since Jeremy mentioned a map. And I've often thought about maps they're not meant to represent 100% the real world, because they're selective in their information. And unfortunately, a lot of maps of colonizations have been about go to take rather than here to honor. And so I love Jeremy's information sharing about then that it's different. It isn't come explore in the way that exploration before was exploitative. It's now more explore in a way to reconnect and to honor what has been sacred. And to me, those are the kind of maps that are amazing, because I'd like to use maps as ways to think about how we navigate spaces. And if we're going to talk about like DEI, for example, I say, well, what's that map? So we can help you move with that, knowing that I'm not guaranteeing safety. You're still going to have to hike. You're still going to have to look for navigation points and whatnot. But here's an invitation to think about that. And so I'll close with the edge that Carolyn mentioned, because as I was mentioning that ecotone in my slides, so ecologists are familiar with the edge effect. And that is that idea. The edge effect is when those two habitats connect at that edge. That's what that ecotone is, that rather than having it be a scary place like, oh no, I'm so far away from like my core, is that the edge effect is a zone of abundance, of creativity, of things that can blossom. You get more species in that space than in the respective habitats. And this is why the celloist Yo-Yo Ma loves talking about the edge effect. And he uses that as a practice to play with musicians that are very different than him, because he says, I get to be more creative through that work and through that challenge. So I see that as an invitation, as Carolyn mentioning, at the edge, it can be scary. And look at what amazingness can happen there, which is, again, it's the language of ecology.
What can emerge? What's emergent? Yeah.
And that, I think that is a perfect note on which to pause the conversation, because this, and I want to thank everyone who has put comments in the chat. Kathy kind of summarized the conversation about stewardship and amazing places and ownership and history and stories. The idea of the landscape. What is a landscape but a map? And what is the edge of the map? Do you fall off or do you pull in? And that point of contact that is really a spark for creativity and connection and relationships. And this conversation is really ongoing. I mean, it's brought to mind other programs that we have had over the years. We were talking about Gretchen Soren's book, Driving While Black, African-American Travel and the Road to Civil Rights. Also Allison Rose Jefferson's book, Living the American Dream, African-American Leisure Sites in the Jim Crow Era, Access to Beaches and Public Parks, and Carolyn's book, Black Faces, White Spaces, and the work that you are doing. I really hope that we can continue the conversation with the three of you and with our audience in different spaces, in the museum, for example, with other exhibitions that we have on view. Librada Romero, From the Desert to the River, and also the exhibit that we just opened yesterday, Border Cantos, Sonic Border. Jose, you brought this up about that landscape, about the landscape of the borderlands, and everything that brings up in terms of humanity's migration and the nature of borders and transcending barriers. So if any of you have any closing comments, I want to give you the space and the time for that. If Carolyn?
No, I was reading the chats because I wanted to respond to people. Just that's what I was looking at. Just
we have something new.
I don't look at them, but I just thank everybody for making space in your own life to think about this, and I guess discover if you don't already know, or continue to grow your edge. I'm, for me, this is, there's no end game. This is the practice. And so for me, and there's always growth there. So I'm excited that we're all on it together in our own way. And yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, Jose. Thank you, Jeremy, all of you. It's just been very exciting, and I feel privileged that we could all have this conversation. And I want to thank our audience again so much for spending your Saturday afternoon with us. And right, we hope to see you at other virtual programs and for the museum, and also at the museum itself. Have a wonderful weekend and stay well. Thank you all again. Take care. Bye-bye.